these aspects of Yeats' philosophy in mind, the context of the question, did she put on his power with his knowledge, changes. In some regards, the daemon can also act like a puppet master pulling strings off-scene. And it could send out positive influences or negative ones. And indeed, sometimes it may offer the seed of potential enlightenment. But it will do it only fitfully. It will throw the seed up into a very small light of your perception. And you have to be sharp enough and quick enough to grab the idea as it sprouts from that fertile subconscious ground within our minds and decide to pull it all the way out of the subconscious. Sort of how we did with the Trojan horse, seeing just a hair of its tail sticking out of the text and grabbing it, pulling it out from the back end. The same process is asked of us on almost every occasion. That some piece of wisdom or the right wisdom or thought is thrown up into our conscious minds by our own daemons. And we fail or succeed to catch those seeds of thought and pursue the higher course. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel the shadows of indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now, I know. The term Yeats uses here, Spiritus Mundi, means the daemon. Spiritus Mundi is an ancient term meant to describe the body of subconscious knowledge. Spiritus meaning spirit and Mundi being world. Spiritus Mundi directly translates to the spirit of the world. What Jung would call the collective unconscious, the memory bank of humanity that is written into our genetics and handed down to us at birth. And so what he asks here, or rather what he tells us, is that a vast image arose out of his subconscious substrate, and it troubled his sight. And the image was of a sphinx crawling across the sand under the pitiless sun. And that image played within Yeats' mind, only momentarily, he says, before it dropped back down into darkness. But Yeats had exercised his will so expertly that when this vision began, and the Spiritus Mundi threw up the seed into his perception, he grabbed it, and he pulled it out, and he watched it. And when he was done watching it, it disappeared back into the Spiritus Mundi. But for him there was no loss. For as he ends, he says, "But now I know." And that is a sign of progress. For most people, they are tricked by their daemon, otherwise known to them as their mind. They feel as if they are stuck in habits and they don't know why the temptations are there at all. And they feel just victim to themselves. This is not who Yeats was. And in this instance, when his mind tempted him, he capitalized on it. He pulled the vision out. He watched it. He learned from it. And then he continued on his path. The example within the Second Coming is a depiction of the same process we're talking about here in Leda, about how the Trojan horse itself rises up out of the text, and that we must actually have to pull it up, to hold on to it, and not let it slip away as maybe, a chance thought. To pull it out and to learn something from it, something special, something profound. And then once we have learned it, to let it go back into the text. So at this point, the question becomes, being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood in the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? Now again, it's very important to pay particular attention here to pronouns, because suddenly Yeats is very specific about her and he and his and the. And so to start this analysis, to begin breaking apart these 3.5 lines, the first thing we should do is classify who it is we know exactly we're talking about. And so we can say that there is some feminine element here, she. There is also a masculine element here, he. And then there is also an objective element here, the indifferent beak. Not his indifferent beak or her indifferent beak, but the indifferent beak. And so it's easy to say that where the beak belongs to the swan, for instance, or that the beak belongs to the person, his power, his mind, his knowledge. But it's not necessarily his, because Yeats doesn't specify. And so to immediately draw those two things together without questioning them first would be a mistake. And so we should separate the 3 different subjects that are within this text before we begin to decipher and reframe it. Now we can approach this reinterpretation first from a strictly linguistic point of view. What I mean by that is we can just look at the words and their definitions. And maybe by altering or choosing different definitions for certain words, we can start to see a greater meaning here. And I think the first word to reconsider is beak. Yeats asks that being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood in the air, and to me this brute blood is the myth of Leda. It's the suggestion of some rape happening above in the previous lines of the poem. So did she, being so caught up by that brute blood, by the daemon of your own mind, being caught up by these carnal images that are being thrown at you, did she put on his knowledge with his power? So what's being asked here is whether or not the reader put on his own knowledge, employed it with enough time to understand and grasp what the reader's daemon was trying to present. And did this occur? Did the daemon put on his knowledge, using his willpower, before the indifferent beak could let her drop? Now again, this idea of something being dropped back down into the darkness, which is the same example of the process as it's described in the second coming, that when the vision, or the opportunity to see the vision, ends, it drops back down into the subconscious darkness, and the reader has missed, or in case of the second coming, been witness to some small lesson. And so the beak here is an interesting point, because we've already sort of defined who she is, the daemon. In this case, we sort of know who he is. It's the reader, in this case being a male reader. But who is the beak, the indifferent beak, that lets her drop? Well, if I'm to think of Yeats' philosophy and say the vision that's recorded in the second coming, and I'm to look at the definitions of beak, now, one of the chiefly British definitions is that of a headmaster, the person who oversees the school. Symbolically or figuratively, you might say that that is the person, that we are all our own headmasters. You oversee yourself. Your conscious mind does, the way that you think and decide to act. And so the question now, if we take the definition of beak to be headmaster and to look at it symbolically as if that is, our self, our conscious mind, the question asks then, being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood in the air, and the phantasmagorical depictions of Leda and this magical, mystical swan, supposedly recorded in the lines above, in the midst of all that, was your daemon, your subconscious mind. Was she able to use your knowledge to point out the greater truth that lay here beneath the first quarter interpretation, to show you something greater? Was she able to do that before your indifferent mind let the vision drop back down into the dark? Now, there is another interpretation of these lines that I was able to come up with, one that sees what's being dropped differently. So whereas in the first interpretation of these lines, I suggest that what drops is the idea, the seed that the daemon tried to push into the reader's conscious mind by throwing out Agamemnon's name. And that when the reader's indifferent mind does not catch that seed and water it with curiosity to discover what was hidden there, then it drops back into the subconscious, never developed. One might also argue, however, that what is dropped into the poem is a veil that locks one out of the deeper meaning. Now, this deeper meaning is, of course, the interpretation of Leda and her myth. A myth that, if understood with Bryant's knowledge, tells us something greater about our world history. And Yeats asks, being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood in the air, did she put on his knowledge before the indifferent beak could let her drop? Now, in this interpretation, the veil that is dropping over the poem comes directly from the mouth of the swan. For if you will recall, in the first few lines, he says that her nape was caught in his bill. And so, taking the image of the swan holding Leda at the back of the neck, you can now reimagine Yeats suggesting that the indifferent beak of Zeus in the swan lets Leda drop. And where she drops to is into the poem, like a veil, cloaking the lines with the first quarter instinctive, sensual, physical, carnal interpretation. And she drops all the way through it and kicks the reader out at the end without knowing what, if anything, were missed. Now, with the backstop sort of unmasked and reinterpreted, the lines reframed now to take away this carnal image of the bird and the girl fighting, and to replace it with Yeats' philosophy, and to understand how the elements are displayed here in this 3.5 line bit. Now, once at this stage, when we have reinterpreted the entire poem with a new meaning, it's important that we understand Yeats' philosophy as best we can before moving forward. Because his philosophy, as it may have been suggested up until this point, serves much greater ideas than just the enlightenment of a single person. As I think I pointed out, it also touches on the evolution of societies and the rise and fall of civilizations according to a massive psychological schema that many ancient authors and even some modern ones believe underpins our life in civilization.